In today's gospel reading, we continue to witness a growing early church. We know from other accounts in the Gospels that Jesus had already given the Great Commission to the 12 apostles who have faithfully followed Jesus. Yet even Jesus knew that 12 wouldn't be enough to bring good news to the poor. In this story, we hear of Jesus sending out, depending on which translation of the text you read, either the 70 or 72 disciples to carry out on a mission in foreign lands, encountering foreign peoples. The exact number isn't terribly important, except to know that there were many, and they were meant to go in pairs, not alone. Jesus warns them that it won't be easy, and that the cost of not only believing, but proclaiming and living out their beliefs in uncharted territory at the mercy of unknown hosts is high. They are to be diligent in their work, humble in their demands, and steadfast in their faith. A reading from the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 1 through 11, and 16 through 20. After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick who are there and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near to you.' But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you. Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near.' Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me, and whoever rejects me rejects the one who sent me." The 70 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, in your name even the demons submit to us." He said to them, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. See, I have given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice at this, that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven."
So whenever July 4th rolls around, I'm the one friend who's adamant about manning the grill with the hot dogs and burgers. Some of my friends who are with us here today are convinced that I'm a grill master or just meat generally. I won't lie, I am. But the other side of the story is that I experience a great sense of nostalgia around the holiday. My parents emigrated from the Philippines in the 1970s to the San Francisco Bay Area. While my mom was and is the great protector of my maternal grandfather's cooking prowess of Filipino delicacies, my dad, who died in 1994, was a huge fan of American food, and really just some things about life in America that he didn't experience as a poor kid growing up in the Philippines. He loved golf, camping, Willie Nelson, and mastering the English language. I can't count the number of times he scolded my 2 older brothers and me and said, "There is no such word as worser." We'd talk back and tease him for saying the number 2 like chew. He was a man with a gap in his teeth. He looked very distinguished, but sometimes it just came out wrong. We talk on July 4th and on other American holidays like Thanksgiving, he'd take over the kitchen and prepare American food, burgers and hot dogs, steaks and mashed potatoes and gravy. The steaks themselves weren't much to write home about. They were covered in Lowry seasoning and tough like shoe leather. We didn't have the Food Network or YouTube instructional videos back then, but his effort at acculturation was undeniable. In fact, his effort at figuring things out for himself and his family without a manual on immigration was commendable. He put his head down, worked hard, and on his way up to provide a life for his family that he didn't have, all in a land that was not his own, in a language that wasn't his first, amidst a culture that was strange, but he sure as hell loved it. He lived the American dream of freedom and prosperity. In fact, I wouldn't be here because of him and my mom. Sundays at church, like today, also remind me of my dad, but not because he came to church. He would drop off my mom, brothers, and me, and then pick us up afterwards, and take us to Emil Villa's Steakhouse for an American-style brunch. Salty or sweet was the debate, a short stack of pancakes or a Denver omelet. But Dad was a pro at brunch. He'd order the hungry man's plate with both sweet and savory. These brunches, or those guilt-ridden Sunday mornings when we didn't make it to Mass, and he'd just whip up a batch of pancakes from Bisquick, or most welcome breaks from a typical Filipino breakfast of garlic fried rice, eggs, and some selection of a canned meat product like Spam, held over from the American colonization of the Philippines in the early 20th century and the Second World War. In fact, the Philippines declared independence from the United States also on July 4th in 1946. They said, "You can go, but we'll keep your Spam." And in one full circle, along with their love of Spam, Filipinos migrated to the United States, straight to the source where Spam is cheaper and in abundance. My family's immigration story is, of course, one of billions of people all across the world, moving from place to place in search of better opportunities, in need of temporary refuge, fleeing violence and persecution, escaping rising waters, forced out of damaged homes from fires, earthquakes, and storms. Our history as congregational churches traces its roots back to the Puritans, escaping religious persecution. Universally, the stories are of people who seek a new life, despite all the risks involved. The stories continue to be written even as we meet this morning. And like many, I am wary of a news cycle that is at once fast and full all the time. In the unrelenting cacophony of tragedy and crisis that capture national and global audiences and spark conversation and outrage, I know many of us close our eyes and repeat the names of victims of violence and discrimination in the hopes of not forgetting not only how they died and suffered, but more importantly, the hopes and dreams they carried for themselves, for the people who came before them. And if they were lucky, these hopes and dreams would continue and grow in the lives of future generations, lives of redemption and salvation. And we're lucky even if we get the names. Sometimes, like this past week, it's a report of more than 2,500, 5,000 migrants held without sufficient food, sanitation, or healthcare in camps, and not the kind of camps our kids go to. Their names are unknown to us. As for the infants and babies among them also held in these camps, their names are likely unknown to themselves. But we know the names of Oscar Martinez and his 23-month-old daughter, Valeria. Only 2 weeks ago tomorrow, Oscar and Valeria were found dead at the Mexican-U.S. border, escaping economic hardship in El Salvador as victims of new immigration policies limiting the number of asylum seekers who can apply for refuge in the United States each day. The young family felt they had no other choice but to take a risk and a perilous route to American soil. In the account of their deaths and their treacherous, unsuccessful crossing of the Rio Grande, there is no mention of their carrying anything but literally the clothes on their back, as pictured. Surely they must have known the dangers involved, the fates of other migrants, the unjust policies being enforced, the jail-like inhumane conditions at private detention centers, and that even if they successfully sought refuge and resettlement, surely they would have heard and seen the racist vitriol and systemic racism that would try to keep them down and forever brand them as the unwelcome. And yet, knowing all this, they still fled their home, and set for a strange land with strange people, with nothing but hope for a new life. And faith in Americans like the 35 of you who met 2 weeks ago to prepare for the refugee family we'll soon welcome. They also had nothing but their unconditional love for each other that drove them to go back and forth for one another and cling to each other against the rising tide and against the heavy current. They hoped that maybe if they kept their heads down, if they worked hard and did their best to acculturate, assimilate, and provide and prove their worth, that maybe then, and only then, they'd be welcome in a country that they'd perhaps already loved. The problem with some of the rhetoric around immigration is that it relies too heavily upon validating the worth of people wishing to come to whatever country they're going to. It's so easy for us to talk about how immigrants built this country as if they've paid their dues, and therefore we should accept more. For some politicians, they argue that we should reform immigration policies to favor more technically qualified candidates, a merit-based system, if you will. The worth of these human beings is somehow wrapped up in the work they've done or can do, rather than their worth as simply human beings and children of God. Oscar, little Valeria, and Oscar's wife Tanya shouldn't have to prove their worth to some random arbiter of value. We've all been in situations where we've been the outsider, the unwelcome. We know what it's like to throw our hands up and say, without appearing angry or confrontational, "I come in peace." We know that the vulnerability in the face of risk feels like, and we know the feeling of true welcome. It feels like belonging. It feels like dignity. It feels like worthiness. It feels like being seen. It feels like enough. It feels like standing tall with your head held high and your shoulders back while you look another in the eye and feel truly equal. I surely felt it when I came to this place. The story we just read of the 70 disciples can easily be seen as a model of Christian discipleship. The call is clear, and so are the instructions. You have to leave everything behind and bring only the message of good news to the poor. But Jesus is also explicit about the risks involved, what it will cost you, and the humility required. And knowing all of this, you are to say yes. And it's okay to think it. It's crazy. No one's ever seen the reward themselves, except for maybe the 12 apostles. And these are instructions from a guy, well, we know what happens to him. But they're also from a guy whose family, after his birth, was forced to flee a foreign land with foreign people, speaking a different language and practicing a different religion. There was no guarantee of safety, much less welcome. His family's journey was a mission impossible, and so was that of the disciples. But written into the mission is a reminder of what it feels like to feel out of place, to feel unwelcome. Their only guarantee is that their names are written in heaven. But the disciples could spread the gospel. Before the disciples could spread the gospel of love, mercy, and justice, they needed to be guests in others' homes. Discipleship, it turns out, is a life of remembering that we are a people who have been welcomed in our past, welcomed by new classmates and teachers, coworkers, and neighbors. We understand the guilt and shame that we feel as people who have been welcomed. We know the sense of indebtedness to a kindness that we feel what we won't ever be able to repay. Or we might fear it's an obligation or duty that's been reluctantly fulfilled in our presence, only to make us feel unworthy. Regardless of the intent on the part of those who have welcomed us, we also know the humility and vulnerability involved in asking for help and asking to belong. So, who are we as a Christian people? We are a welcoming people, certainly. We strive to do the work that Jesus taught us to do, recorded in Matthew 25, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, and indeed, welcome the stranger. The commission in Luke doesn't exist in the other Gospels. It goes further than the others. It's not just 12, it's 70. The names of the 12 are known. The 70 are unnamed. The task isn't to be welcoming, it's to be welcomed. We are a people who have been welcomed, and therefore we are a people who know what it's like to be welcomed. By our baptism, we are a people who know what it's like to be claimed by God's divine family, despite our shortcomings, and in fact, especially because of our shortcomings. We are members of a family so eager to extend that welcome to others, just as the Son of God taught us and just as we experience it. The proclamation of God's family is a bold and risky one. To believe in a divine family and to have faith in family members whom we haven't even met, but somehow we love. And how do we know we're part of this family or God's family? Because we struggle. We all know what it's like to struggle with the ones we love. And here's the beauty of God's family. There will always be a place for us at God's table in God's house. The abundance of God's grace poured out through us by Christ is without measure. When we struggle with each other, there's still a place for us. When we struggle with ourselves, we still have God's unconditional love and forgiveness to feast upon. When we struggle with God, God still calls us God's own. This is God's grace. God's grace is that which we, as a part of the 70, are called to harvest for all to take part in and experience, just as we experience it ourselves. The harvest is plentiful. All that is needed are laborers. God needs our help to gather, to tend, to make room for even more. What does the harvest even look like? It's a bountiful feast that welcomes us to God's table. It's that gospel feast of love and justice meant for all to enjoy. A reminder, the disciples in the story were many, they were unnamed, and we don't know where they came from. While it might be very easy to imagine who gets to play the role of the disciples, the fact is there are strangers among us who have also been welcoming hosts. Likewise, there are wolves who appear as lambs, and lambs who we mistake as wolves. Compared to Oscar, Valeria, Tanya, and the tens of thousands in the immigration crisis, my family received what we would call an extravagant welcome. In Luke, the Lord warns the disciples that they will be lambs amongst wolves. I don't doubt that people in the 1970s in America feared my ancestors would be wolves stealing jobs and draining resources. I also don't doubt that my family encountered some well-meaning lambs with prejudice and racism that weren't as overt as they are now. My family wasn't more deserving of an extravagant welcome than Oscar, Valeria, and Tanya. So, was Oscar, whose name means God's spear, the wolf or the lamb? Was little Valeria, whose name means to be strong, the wolf or the lamb? What if there is no food set before you at the home of your host, like the detention centers at our borders? And what if there is a harvest, but you aren't allowed to labor? And what if you're caged day and night like a wolf and die at an age barely able to count sheep? Are Oscar and Valeria's names not written in heaven? So, friends, what do we do as observers of the migration crisis and the needless deaths of Oscar and his daughter? Clearly, there are answers that perhaps could have prevented the fate they faced, but as people of extravagant welcome and as people who know and love a God who still speaks, we must continue to ask ourselves, how can we continue making a more just and loving world where death and suffering don't have the last word? For we are also an Easter people, ones of an unflinching hope in the resurrection and ones who believe in limitless grace. When we cry and shout, "Why?" and "No more," it's on us to continue to take risks, make a stand, and proclaim that the good news of the kingdom of God is here on earth as it is in heaven. Our story today tells us that along with the message that the kingdom of God is near, there is work to be done and more people to recruit for a harvest of God's grace to be shared, and a great feast of love and justice to be prepared for all to partake in. We have been also warned that the task ahead of us is hard and costly. Welcoming is easier for some than others, but if we start from a place of humility and understanding that we have all been welcomed, we'll know the meaning of extravagant welcome.